The reading is written in the first chapter of Exodus. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Bethom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. "When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live." But because the midwives fear God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time." So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live." Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God. Word of God, speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest in your holiness. Word of God, speak.
The Lord be with you. Well, dear ones, it happened again. This week, as I was preparing for my sermon, I ended up with another invasive, relentless earworm. For those of you who may not have heard this, I am frequently plagued by earworms, aka stuck song syndrome, aka the song that just lodges itself in your brain and will not let go. I do promise that at some point I will have a sermon where this isn't the case, that I preach on it, but this week and the last time I preached, we're just stuck. Just stuck. So this week's song companion is a song from folk artist Carrie Newcomer. She's somebody you all may not have heard of, but I highly encourage y'all to check her out and listen to her music. She's got some great stuff. And this week's earworm was a song called "One Woman and a Shovel." And it tells the story of an Ohio River Valley community that while development was happening, the government had come and said, "Build a dam so that your valley can be used for commercial transportation and the boats can come." But building the dam meant stagnant water. Stagnant water meant illness. Illness in that time meant death. And so the story goes that, fed up with the harm being done to her community, one woman marched down to the dam, a hoe and shovel in either hand, bound to dig for every woman and man who lay sick with fever. And then the chorus goes, "Well, it's time to say enough and to set things right. The whole world's waist deep in trouble. Never doubt or question the power of love, or one woman with a shovel." The story goes on that her whole community joins her, and eventually they tear down the dam and the sickness leaves, and they can't find any jury or judge to prosecute them. It's a great song. I highly recommend you look it up. At this point, you may be wondering, what does one woman, a dam, and her shovel have to do with two midwives from the Bible. Maybe you don't, maybe you see where this is going, but maybe you're wondering. Here it is. These women, these stories are about women who looked at the world around them, saw hurt and pain, and in a moment where they could have chose to be overwhelmed by the bigness of the problems, convinced of their smallness, or surrendered to it's the way things have always been attitude, they didn't. Instead, they acted right where they were. My guess is, as those women rushed to the births of the Hebrew women, they knew that they couldn't change the entire oppressive situation. They knew that they could not end slavery. They knew that they could not magically make more resources for the slaves, and they couldn't free the slaves from the oppression. But they knew that there was something they could do. So rather than surrendering, they chose another way. They knew the power of starting small. They knew the power of starting right where they were. They knew the power of not waiting until they knew enough or waiting until they were the right person in power. They knew that they couldn't fix the large-scale problem, but they could act right where they were and make a change right where they were. As we tell this story, it is important to take a moment to look back. Out of curiosity, because somebody said after service, last service, how many of you have heard the story of Shiphrah and Puah before? How many of you is this a brand new story that you've never heard, really? Okay, so let me put some context around this, right? Shiphrah and Puah is a story that comes after Joseph. So Joseph, that, amazing Technicolor dream coat, Joseph, right? He is sold into slavery by his brothers because they're jealous of his power to interpret dreams and because their father favors him. And once he's in slavery, it is his power of dream interpretation that allows Joseph to work his way into the Pharaoh's court and become one of Pharaoh's advisors. And in that moment, he is able to interpret a dream that Pharaoh has about fat and skinny cows to help the Egyptians store up food during the abundant years so that when famine strikes, they have the resources to protect and save their people. When that famine strikes, not all of the area had the same advantage of having a Joseph in their lives, and so people came to Egypt seeking refuge and food. This included many Hebrew people, including Joseph's family and those brothers that sold him into slavery. That is a whole nother story. Someday we will get there. But now we find ourselves years after Joseph's death. His entire generation is gone, and fear has begun to arise because the Pharaoh, the new king, does not remember what Joseph offered the community. And so instead of being grateful and remembering their history together, this king is more afraid of what will happen if Hebrew immigrants become more numerous than Egyptian natives. And fear leads quickly to oppression and hatred. Or in the words of a wise being, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And that is what we see in this text today, right? We see how fear leads to anger, how anger leads to the hatred of the other, and that hatred leads to the suffering and oppression of other people. It is out of fear that Pharaoh orders the Israelites to work more. He gives them fewer resources, harsher punishment, and finally, that unimaginable act of fear, he commands the midwives to kill all the Hebrew baby boys. And this is where our heroes for the day enter the story. Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives we hear who fear God more than Pharaoh, so they decide to ignore the order of hatred. And this word that is translated fear, I always struggled with this word, because I can't imagine these two women being so afraid of God that they are shaking in their boots, afraid of retribution or punishment. But that's not what it means. This word in Hebrew is not about haunted house afraid. It is actually a word more closely resembling awe or reverence. It is an action. Their action is not one that comes out of being afraid of punishment, but an action that comes out of an awe of God and what God can do and what they know God's story to be. So in short, the midwives are more in awe of God than they are afraid of Pharaoh. The midwives are more in awe of God than they are afraid of Pharaoh. And so those women start small. They play on the prejudices that Pharaoh and the fear that Pharaoh has of the Hebrew women, and they allow the baby boys to live, saying, these women are not like us. I heard you all laugh at that point, right? Right. Pharaoh is so afraid of the Hebrew women that doesn't register to him as ridiculous. And so they use that and they play it to their advantage, and they choose hope and life over fear and death. And it is those small actions, those everyday decisions, those small disobediences that lead to big ripple effects. Because small actions ripple out in ways we will never know. Because here's the thing, Shifra and Puah starts at the beginning of Exodus. Does anybody know what the rest of the Exodus story is? Moses. Right? It is the ripple of the story of the birth of Moses. It is the thing that follows this story immediately, is the story of Moses being born and hidden. Moses, who is only allowed to live because a midwife allowed him to live, subverting an order of death. A baby boy only allowed to live because of a mother's love, believed in hope and action rather than fear. A daughter who subverts her father's fear and brings Moses into the Pharaoh's house. It is only because of the ripples that ripple out farther and farther and farther until Moses is the one doing the thing Pharaoh is afraid of. He is the one leading the Hebrew people out of slavery and towards the promised land. Small actions, big ripples. So what does this mean today, right? We don't have an oppressive Pharaoh leading us. We don't have all of that in the ways that they did. But we do have forces of fear and hatred that enslave us in different ways. There are forces of fear that surround us, fear of others, fear of the unknown, fear of differing opinions, fear of what happens if, what. There's fear everywhere. And that fear so quickly leads to anger and hatred. And it can feel suffocating. But here's the thing. Said it in my first sermon, and you will hear me say it over and over again. There have always, almost always, been these moments in human history. Human history has never not had a place where it is feeling like the world is falling apart. Human history has never not had moments where it feels like people are giving into the fear and the hatred. Human history has always had hurt and pain and suffering as part of the story. And human history has always had people who looked at the world around them, and instead of being overwhelmed, they decided to act right where they were. Human history has always had people who were willing to start small. And we can see this. There are writings all over the place. There are religious writings in the Talmud, which is the Jewish tradition's wisdom writings. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justice now. Walk humbly now. Love mercy now. And this is my favorite part. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Or there's the reading in Hebrews that maybe you know. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so, many have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Or there are some more recent saints. Saint Teresa of Lisieux, who I just learned about. Remember that nothing is small in the eyes of God. Do all you do with love. Or well-known Mother Teresa. Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. Or some of our modern-day social scientists and authors. Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Or one of my favorite wise women of today, Glennon Doyle, just do the next right thing. One thing at a time. Dear ones, we live in a time and in a world where I feel like it can be really easy to turn on the news and be overwhelmed with the feeling of smallness and inadequacy. It can be easy to think we are not big enough to do anything or change anything or impact anything. But this week, I invite you to tell yourself a different story. I invite you to not give in to the overwhelm, but to look where you are right now. Look around you and do the next right thing now. Bring in cereal to support Cam. Support a Christmas Angel family. Volunteer with Cam or our chaplain team or our second family team. Send snail mail to somebody you love to remind them that you are praying for them. Send a text message to somebody to remind them that you are praying for them. Say thank you to somebody whose small action impacted your lives in ways they may not know. Call a grieving friend even if you don't feel like you know or have the right words to say. That phone call means more than anything. Share a hug. Listen to a little one's story. Listen to an older one's story. Invite somebody to your Thanksgiving table. The world is full of ways that we can start small. So, dear ones, don't doubt the power of your small actions in a world that is hurting and broken. Because with a little bit of that crazy faith that Pastor Brad was talking about last week, our God is a God who acts through small actions and sends out ripples that we can never imagine. And it doesn't rhyme or flow as well as Carrie Newcomer's song does. But never, never doubt or question the power of love or a community with an amazing God. And all of God's people said,
Please stand as you're able.
I love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my